of cybersecurity. I see one hand. That is awesome, because this is an introduction. And so if all of you were very familiar with it, that would kind of suck for me and for you. So if I was to ask who knows what defense in depth is, I suspect everybody would raise their hand, or just about everybody. Not everybody, but just about everybody. But I also suspect we'd all give different answers on what it is. And I'm going to keep that trend, because I'm going to actually give you two definitions of defense in depth. The first one, which is what I call a backstop, is really the concept that you have defense in depth so that if a control fails, another control can still stop your adversary. So an example would be if you had the best practice of having a different malware vendor on your mail gateway than you have on your client systems. Because if they're using different signatures, that would mean that even if the first one doesn't detect it, the second one has a chance to do so. That's less relevant today because of the amount of sharing of that type of what used to be considered, well, it is intellectual property, but used to be considered very proprietary, is now shared quite a bit. But another example in the malware area would be having antivirus on your clients, but then also on your firewall deploying a blocking rule for known command and control networks. And so if a virus gets in that doesn't have a signature and the heuristics doesn't catch it, then it may still be blocked if it uses a command and control network by the firewall. The second definition is the castle approach. The concept of defense in depth, where you talk about layers that your adversary has to cross through. A very common example here would be having the external network, having a public DMZ, and then have an internal network. So that a adversary trying to gain access to your internal network needs to traverse the DMZ or phish your users. But that's why good defense in depth also has internal segmentation, so that when they own the user's workstation, they still have layers of defense to get through. This is also sometimes called the onion model, where you see the layers listed in concentrical circles. This is also another way to view that, which is less associated with, or it doesn't have as much to do with segmentation, which is to have, you have your physical controls, you have your perimeter controls, you have your internal network, you have application controls, you have data protection, and having these multiple layers. One of the reasons why this is becoming more relevant is we talk a lot about our porous external network and the skill that people are using at reaching our internal network with malware. The other thing is a guy that I know, I've had lunch with a couple of times, reached out to me because he now works for a cloud service provider, and he's trying to figure out how he can implement defense in depth within that cloud environment. Because while he has segments for the internal administration for his machines, where his customers put stuff, he doesn't have a lot of control of and doesn't necessarily know where that is. So he's really we're pointing him more in this direction, where he's thinking more of what kind of controls can I put around data where appropriate, but the host itself, and those kind of controls. The next thing I'm going to talk about is the time equation. Again, the time equation is oftentimes associated with defense in depth, but it really doesn't have anything to do with defense in depth. Matt, I forgot my joke.
I wasn't going to say anything.
I was going to talk about how I might have to introduce, if I was wrong about the blood, I might have to introduce Matt to the chair, because that does leave a lasting impression on people when I have to do that.
How many times do you have to do that in the past?
With a chair, none. With an M16, we'll not talk about that. So they call it repelling the attacker with fire in close combat for a reason. So anyways, I'm sorry. I apologize for getting distracted. The time equation is a way of thinking about the controls that you have and assessing the validity and whether you have sufficient controls. And what it is it's the time to detect plus the time to respond must be less than the time to failure. The time for your controls to fail, your protections to fail, or the time for your controls to be breached. And if it is, then that's great. That set of controls is effective and you move on. If it isn't, then there's one of three things that you can do. You can do something, three categories of things you can do. You can do something to increase your detection, whether that's deploy more sensors, have a longer span of time that you're monitoring, or a broader area that you monitor. Or you decrease your response time with automated controls, with, again, having people that are more readily available, changing your SLAs for time to respond to an alert if you're on an on-call situation. Or the other thing is increasing your time to failure. And oftentimes that's done by adding additional controls, and controls that would be considered defense in depth. Diversity of defense is actually a different topic and a different concept. The reason that there's a lot of crossover is because of the first example that I gave, where I talked about multiple vendors. But the reason that's defense in depth is because the signature base is different. It's actually, while it's a very similar control, they actually catch different things, and therefore it's defense in depth. Diversity of defense as a concept is the idea of using different vendors for the sole purpose of using different vendors, to make sure that, as an example, if there's a vulnerability in their software, that you can bypass, as an example, the IDS detection, the way that it handles fragmentation, or a way that the TCP handshake works, if you can bypass a firewall. Well, if you're using one vendor, then you can bypass all your firewalls. And so that created this idea of diversity of defense in making sure that you have multiple vendors. The other thing is a configuration error. Now, assuming that you don't have the same people that are configuring both systems, because if you do, they're quite likely to put that configuration error in both vendors. Having different vendors can limit the chance of having a configuration error that exposes your network. The problem is there's significant trade-offs to having diversity of defense. The first one is complexity. You make a much better, or a much more complex environment. And I know Matt's going to hit on this kind of hard, this slide, this area, so I'll kind of go over it a little faster than I had intended. It also increases costs. It increases costs because now you're using two separate products, because you need to create experts in both of these products to deal with difficult problems, especially since you already have a more complex network. And then the other thing is that by having two vendors, you're likely buying in less bulk when you make a purchase. And therefore, you're going to a lot of times get less discounts than you would if you made that purchase from one vendor for both of those sets of products. And so all of that stuff adds complexity and time. Time for deployments. Say, for an example, if you're upgrading all of your firewalls, if you have one vendor, it's relatively straightforward. Obviously, there's testing and everything involved. But if you have one vendor on multiple code chains, that can be a little more complex because you basically have to test them separately. But if you have two different vendors, all of that has to be tested very separately. It really is two separate test plans, and you have to take that into account. The other thing that I believe is related to diversity of defense, but I didn't necessarily see anybody else out there that was writing about this, but since I have the microphone, I guess I get to share it with you, is the concept of whether or not you combine a lot of different security products onto one platform. And that's an idea that's debated quite a bit. I believe that's a diversity of defense issue for people who don't want to do that. They want to make sure that they have that diversity. I'm actually personally a fan and advocate of having specialized software packages, companies that specialize in activity. One of my concerns is that not only is that way you know that you're dealing with somebody that's focused on that, but the other thing is that way a company's asset allocation considerations don't, without my knowing, affect my security stance. right? If they decide that my core security product is not as profitable for them, so they move all of their R&D dollars or the majority of their R&D dollars to a different product line, I'm not going to know that because they're not going to tell me. But you have the same problem, right? There's a lot of integration advantages to moving stuff to one product, to one platform, if you will. The other thing is that in addition to the integration, you can actually save quite a bit of money by doing that. I worked with one organization, I worked for one organization, that was actually one of their strategies. One of our strategies was to reduce the number of platforms. And the risks were taken into account, and that was deemed to be the strategy that we were going to follow. And it's a very appropriate strategy. So with respect to defense in depth, I think it's about making sure that you consider diversity of defense. I think I said defense in depth. Making sure you consider diversity of defense. But it doesn't mean that diversity of defense has to be, a rule of thumb. Two exceptions, I guess, real quick. One is nuclear, that is actually written in, although that's more from a reliability standpoint than it is from a security standpoint. And then the other one, when I was in DoD, our boundary firewalls, as an example, could not have any services on it that were not part of being a firewall. No proxy servers, no DNS, none of that stuff. I don't know if that's true anymore, and I don't think any of us are in the Department of Defense to worry about it. It isn't true anymore. I know that the Air Force has PAs, but I don't know if they're on the boundary. So the sliding scale of cybersecurity. Wonderfully speaking, none of you know about it. I'm sorry, only one person knows about it. There's a paper on the SANS website written by a guy named Robert Lee. Not the forensics Robert Lee, but the industrial control system Robert Lee. Written about the sliding scale of cybersecurity. And so it's something that I like to introduce to people, particularly when I'm talking about defense in depth and have a little bit of extra time. So the sliding scale of cybersecurity basically breaks things up into 5 categories: architecture, passive defense, active defense, intelligence, and offense. And the idea is by doing that categorization, you can look to see if there's area where you are lacking in investment, or you have maybe too much investment. Excuse me. And so you can look at it that way. It is also a way to kind of evaluate where you're going to spend your money and how you're going to spend your money. It's worth noting that this sliding scale, which I can't point at, doesn't have 5 points on it. It has 5 categories and many points. So as an example, if you are collecting data and you're exploiting that data to find TTPs and different things that you should be monitoring for and monitoring on, and you produce an intelligence product, and I use that term in the way that an intelligence analyst would use it, not a vendor would use it, but you create an intelligence product. If that data collection was on your own network, that's intelligence, but it's closer over onto the active defense side. If that data collection is on your adversary's network, it's still intelligence, but it's closer to the offensive side. And in fact, gets you close to pivoting into offensive operations if your company or if your organization so decides to. My position, and we certainly won't go into it much, but is that almost no company should be doing offensive operations. It's worth noting that I said that to somebody at the InfraGard meeting, and they believed I was talking about pen testing, that nobody should pen test. That's absolutely not the case. Everybody should be pen testing. But pen testing is more on the passive defense side than it is on the offensive side. Offense is acting against your adversary's network and systems. The other thing that I'd mention about the sliding scale of cybersecurity that Rob Lee goes into quite a bit of detail is the value. You tend to have greater value created or extracted from investments on the left-hand side of the scale. And if you look at it as an example, let's say the extreme case, if we have a network that has no controls, there's no controls out there. When you think about deploying a boundary firewall, or say writing some files that if an adversary takes them, they would call home. And then those files would give you intelligence. It would tell you, for instance, where on your network the adversary was. It would potentially tell you what types of information they're looking for if they took some of the files and not others. That would all be in the intelligence, or that would be intelligence. Well, you're going to get a bigger bang for your buck, all other things being equal, deploying a boundary firewall. That doesn't mean that intelligence gathering isn't important. It is very important. But your initial investments are likely to be more effective on the architecture, the passive defense side, the left-hand side of the scale. Similarly, the scale is foundational. And what I mean by that is the things on the left-hand side build the foundation for the things on the right-hand side. So as an example, if you are doing active defense and you don't have segmentation, or you say it another way, if you do have segmentation, you can leverage that to do better active defense by having that foundation built, which is the stuff on the left-hand side. So if you are lacking on the stuff on the left-hand side, you definitely should be focusing on it. But obviously, if you were to look at where your investments have been and you have none on the intelligence side, there's a good chance that you should be looking in that direction. Forgot to remove that. In summary, we talked about defense in depth. We talked about the time equation. We talked about the diversity of defense. And I introduced you to the sliding scale of cybersecurity. In a moment, I'm going to turn the reins over to Matt over there. And then at the end, we're actually going to do kind of a joint questions together. But is there any real quick questions that somebody they're burning to ask right now and can't wait till after Matt talks? Great.
All right. So now it's my turn to tell everybody that Don was wrong and I'm right. Which actually is not the case at all. I really like following Don because he's validation that what I'm thinking and what I'm trying to convey to you guys is actually hopefully fairly accurate. So let me get signed in here and we can get going. Just play the Pokemon music. That seems to be all I hear lately. So speaking of Pokemon Go, who's playing here? Are you guys anyone here playing? Figured half the room would be. Not that at this moment. Please don't play at this moment. I just in general. I was walking around my neighborhood last night, and like 3 kids were walking around. I could hear the music. It was weird. It was like following me, which is weird because it was following me anyway because I had a plane also. But you hear this echo of the same thing. What's that?
Why else would you be walking around your neighborhood?
Definitely not for exercise. Actually, that's a very foreign idea to me. So this is going to be a great thing in my life, I hope. So, defense in depth. The whole reason why I want to talk about this is I've literally had people tell me that they want to run multiple vendors for defense in depth. They want 2 different URL filtering solutions. It's very frustrating because I really think there's a lot to be gained from consolidating your resources into an effective platform and looking at it with a different type of view rather than strictly a multi-vendor strategy. So some personal background. I'm a systems engineer at Palo Alto Networks. I covered this area actually, and consumers energy is one of my accounts, so fair disclosure. I spent a lot of time here. I was previously a SOC network engineer here at Consumers Energy also, and worked under Don, under Jim, who is now missing, and Christian, who I was hoping would be here, but I'm sure we'll see him soon. August, right?
Who? What?
Yeah, exactly.
Mark? Good?
Christian.
Christian? Yeah. I don't know. Maybe. Who?
All right. So I have a bachelor's of science. Bachelor's of computer science from MSU. I was born and raised here in Jackson, so I decided to go to school up in Lansing and decided to come back and work for the company that kind of, I'm not going to say built the city, but is definitely known in the area as a landmark, if you will. I mean, we're the only 12-story building that was built in like I want to say the last 50 years. So anyway, awesome company. I'm a general technologist. I love everything that has to do with phones, computers, and that's kind of how I got my start, was just screwing around with computers. Don't know why Jeepers up there. It was supposed to be down further because video gamer ties into this. Started building my own hardware for just playing video games, which is fun. Speaking of video gaming, like I mentioned, Pokemon Go, please keep from playing it during the presentation. We'll have time later on the way to go get dinner or drinks if you decide to eat beforehand. I'm a chronic procrastinator, which is really a bummer because I wanted to show you guys a live demo of this, but for the sake of not making it product specific, which by the way, I do work at Palo Alto Networks, I'm going to try and keep this as generic as possible. I don't want it to be a sales pitch, and please shout, yell, throw something soft if it becomes too salesy. Not a chair, please. Is it empty or full?
We'll find out here in a second.
Please be one or the other. Half empty and open is not preferred with all the electronics.
Dreaded code red.
It is code red. So, my take on this is a little bit different, but I think it ties in nicely to the sliding scale that Don talked about. In the middle there, he had active defense. And what I really consider to be active defense, the core of active defense, is the cyber attack kill chain, or the cyber attack life cycle. Because Lockheed Martin branded the kill chain, I'm not supposed to say kill chain. So forget that I said that. We're going to talk about the cyber attack life cycle. It's very similar. In fact, there's 6 categories instead of 7. And this one, weaponization and delivery, really is the sum of 2 categories. So essentially the same thing. So in the context of the cyber attack life cycle, obviously this describes the way an attack is performed at a very high level, at a framework level. And I think there's a lot of value to be gained in looking at how you protect against attacks, specifically in looking at this attack life cycle and mapping that technology and process to those certain areas. So in the case of reconnaissance, you have active and passive reconnaissance, right? Active would be something that an actor is doing or an attacker is doing to discover information. So port scans or maybe website crawling. In the case of passive, you'd be talking third-party websites, things that you can't detect on or things that are really don't interact with the target in any way. Social media is a big one. In fact, I believe GERCON last year, there was a really cool talk about, what was it? It was about scraping LinkedIn and LinkedIn, the other thing I don't use, Twitter. Damn Twitter. So scraping all these social media sites to pull this, what was that, Don? Oh, man. Thanks, Jim. Anyway, and Pastebin. Pastebin's another big one. Pastebin, I think recently, I'll say recently, within the last year, announced their monitoring service where you can put in keywords and alert off of, say, maybe your domain if it shows up on Pastebin, which is cool, but at the same time, attackers can also use it to quickly search and alert on new things about their target. So it's a double-edged sword there. And of course the written news, but who uses the written news these days? Actually, it wasn't a question, but thank you. That's really interesting.
I run a newspaper.
Oh, I'm so sorry. I didn't.
Not for long!
Oops. Is it a digital newspaper? Like a...
No.
Ooh.
Keep going, Matt.
All right. So moving on to weaponization and delivery. This is your phishing emails, your drive-by downloads, and the classic USB dropped in a parking lot. This is how you deliver the malware, or deliver the hook your users. Exploitation. So performing an exploit to exploit a vulnerability in software, or potentially just install something that isn't exploitable, but maybe it's just have the user install something. Actually, I'm sorry, I'm skipping ahead. Exploitation leads to, in almost every case, code execution on the target or some sort of information disclosure in the case of like SQL injection. Installation. So this is the installation of your remote access tools, backdoors, Trojans, startup scripts. These aren't necessarily taking advantage of any exploit in software. This is just a malicious piece of code. And this is where I like to draw the line personally between malware and an exploit. All right, exploits are a vulnerability that's being taken advantage of, and malicious code is just something that does something bad but it doesn't necessarily take advantage of a vulnerability. In the case of command and control, real common things you see, IRC, web-based types of command and control. Even to this day, I hopped on the SANS Internet Storm Center, and there was I forget exactly which one, but it was a very recent article talking about breaking down command and control for a particular piece of malware, and it was still using unencrypted web-based command and control, which is a bummer for them. It's good for us. And then you still see it sometimes, but tunneling over UDP53. That's a very obviously common open port, and we have good defenses for that in the common age, and the age that we're in, but it's still a thing. And then actions on the target, right? This is your scraping of credentials using PW dump, exfiltrating the data, and then repeating the cycle, right? At that point, you pivot and you begin reconnaissance, maybe network scanning of devices on your same layer 2 network. And then you weaponize and exploit, install something, and then get command and control on the new target. So the cycle really repeats over and over and over again. So I know we saw, or most of us saw, Jim's presentation last week or last month, and I hope this covers the high-level review of that. So defense in depth, I really take defense in depth and apply it specifically to that kill chain mentally, and I think it ends up having a good result on how you can break down that attack. Traditionally, defense in depth came about because point solutions that were developed to solve specific needs, right? So you had firewalls, and you had an IPS, and you had a web app firewall, and proxies for URL filtering, and DLP appliances. The list can really go on. There's a lot of different types of technology that do these things. And that was really not, I'm going to say not by design, it's just a consequence of the way the marketplace works, right? Someone would specialize and be very good, and because they did well, they were adopted widely, and it's how it developed. So you'd see a different vendor for each technology, and then at some point, the competitors become so big, or other big companies become hungry for a piece of that market. They then consolidate products through mergers and acquisitions. We see it all the time. I think one of the most recent ones that I saw, I'm not picking it because it's a competitor, but literally I just saw it last week. Cisco purchased CloudLock, a CASB cloud-based security solution, which you think is kind of a departure from Cisco's normal platform, right? They are a routing, switching, hardware company. Well, this is the case, right? They see technology that fits a void in their portfolio and purchase it. Defense in depth is, like Don had mentioned, not necessarily a multi-vendor strategy. At its core, I see it as a layering of these technologies to cover gaps in the attack lifecycle. And it's not just technology. Actually, there's a lot of business process that becomes a part of your defenses. Backups is a big one, as we'll see in the case of a later example. Your patching process is also seen as I want to say active defense, but in your sliding scale, would you consider what do you think, Don?
Backups?
No, your patching process.
Oh, I'm sorry. It is actually considered architecture.
Architecture.
Real close to passive defense.
Okay. So everyone asks, but what about the example of? Do you have a question?
No, I started to say I think maybe I should look it up. You said it was such a compliment.
No, just tell them something and never look back. So, but what about the case where there is a vulnerability and that renders your technology completely ineffective? It happens. The TCP split handshake is a totally allowable RFC spec. It's a thing that can happen. Now, who here is familiar with the regular three-way TCP handshake when you open a connection? That's good. No. So that's good. In the case of the split handshake, so the second packet of that three-way handshake, right? There's a synchronization packet that goes from the client to the server. The server responds with a SYN ACK back to the client, and the client sends an ACK in response. That middle packet with the SYN ACK set, that's using the concept called piggybacking. It's allowable in TCP specs. It's not necessarily, or it wasn't intended to be standard. The split handshake happens when you actually have a four-way handshake where the client sends a SYN, the server acknowledges that SYN, and then sends its own separate SYN in another packet, and the client acknowledges that back. So you have basically the same flags that are set in 4 packets instead of 3. Very simple design. It was supposed to be totally allowable. and it never really was done in practice. It's a very uncommon thing, which is why I think most firewall vendors totally overlooked it. Around 2011, there was a vulnerability, I don't know the exact CVE, where if that handshake was performed, firewalls would stop processing, certain firewall brands, would stop processing any deep packet inspection. They would basically treat it as an open session or an orphan session that didn't fit the session table, so it was just allowed. In that case, you would completely bypass things like URL filtering performed in the firewall, IPS, DLP, the list goes on. If it's an advanced feature, it's gone at that point, including SSL decryption. So it is a big deal, and it happens, and it's a bummer when it happens. And that's certainly something to weigh in, that it is a negative to the single source design. So does this put us back to a multi-vendor strategy? And I really don't think it does. That puts us back to the vendor diversity that Don mentioned. And I think there's a lot of negatives that come along with that, right? There's a high operational cost of having to deal with patching and managing multiple platforms. And along with that, you have disparate logging platforms. You can centralize it as SIM, but the management solutions for these different devices usually don't integrate in a very clean way, if they integrate at all. There's a high training cost. New employees have to be spun up on, let's say, 10 to 15 technologies versus 5 to 7. So it increases the onboarding time, increases the complexity, and quite frankly, puts you in this SME hell where you have specific people that do specific things, and it tends to be difficult to get coverage, especially if it's on our operations side. You have maybe a firewall guy. Maybe it's not just a firewall guy, but it's a Cisco guy. And then you have a checkpoint guy, and you have a Palo Alto Networks firewall guy, and maybe an F5 guy, and maybe a Blue Coat guy. And you see how that kind of snowballs into your staff becomes bloated, and people, they get shoehorned into a role, and quite frankly, it makes them unhappy, and I think it makes it very difficult to support. And you do get a high rate of error. I tend to believe you do. When these experts in a particular product try to move to a different product that works similar, like Checkpoint and Cisco, they're both firewalls, right? Well, they don't always work the same way. Any doesn't always mean any. And I'm going to bash a little bit on Checkpoint because I used to use it and it was very frustrating. When you put any port, you'd think it would mean any port. They have an implied exclusion to any being X11. So port 6000 through 6040. Well, that doesn't count as any. So you have to actually explicitly allow that plus any. It's really frustrating as a user. And every other firewall expert out there would be baffled by it unless they're a Checkpoint expert. So again, very frustrating. So jumping back to the kill chain, let's map these types of technologies out into the different stages and see what we can do. So in the case of reconnaissance, passive reconnaissance, good luck. There's really nothing you can do. By the nature of it, they are not intrusive. You have no knowledge of it, and quite frankly, there's nothing you can do. Sorry. But you can do some things with active. This gets a little fuzzy. I'm going to say they're soft counters. There's still ways of performing this and getting around detections, right? Maybe with an IPS, you can implement some port scan signatures. Now, you could just slow down the port scan, and maybe it wouldn't trip the signature, right? So there's always counters to these. But at a high level, this is how I would go about it personally. And maybe implement signatures for web crawling activity. Web crawlers are pretty easy to spot in general, but really good ones look like real users. You can rate limit the requests, insert dummy refer headers, or spoof user agents to make it look like a real person. Now, the rate of transmission, obviously, or the rate of clicking or navigating a page is one great way to tell if it's a user versus a web crawler. But again, that can be all mimicked. And maybe with a web app firewall, you could do something like deny access to specific directories or admin pages. Maybe, and this is a bit of a hit or miss, my favorite is the robots.txt file. Put on web pages to tell web crawlers what not to look at, which by the nature of a security professional or an attacker, that's exactly what you want to look at, is the things that people don't want you to see. And sometimes they're interesting, and sometimes they're just a crappy service that really can't be indexed very well. So in the case of weaponization and delivery, what do you guys think we do about host-based technologies? Where would you start? Anybody?
I would install Bit9 and Carbon Black.
Good. It's a good start. Try not to keep it product specific. But I would go with some antivirus, right? Antivirus is a good start, although it's marginally effective. It gives you coverage for your known malware. Maybe go with application whitelisting, right? Because then you can start covering things that aren't known to be bad, and you don't know that they're good either. But maybe you just don't want to do it because it's dumb, right? You can put folder-based exclusions in. So maybe don't execute from the temporary internet folder, files folder, or maybe don't allow execution from Outlook temp. Who here has had a user that's been emailed, expense report.pdf with a million spaces and .exe tagged at the end, and they opened it, right? It happens. And if it hasn't happened, I can bet there's a user in a company of maybe even only 1,000 employees. You're going to get one. The hit rate is probably pretty damn good. So in that case, just disallow execution from the Outlook temp folder. Most users won't even understand why it doesn't work, and they're going to move on, right? Yes, it can be circumvented. They could save it to their desktop and then open it. Bummer, they got around it. But most users, I'm going to be a little offensive here. I'm sorry, most users aren't going to figure that out. You can implement the execution of signed and trusted executables, again with whitelisting software, or potentially stop known and unknown. And use that to stop known and unknown malware. Now there's the caveat, right, that it could stop good applications. It could stop real user activity, like in Internet Explorer when you hit run instead of save on an executable, it downloads it to your temporary internet folders file. Yes. Temporary internet files folder, and runs it. In the case of my example of blocking execution from there, right, that wouldn't work. So it could cause some help desk strain, but quite frankly, I think they're very low-level hanging fruit that you can implement to maybe harder than I think. Sometimes. Keep me honest. And maybe you move on to malware sandboxing, right? This would give you coverage for previously unknown polymorphic malware, things that you don't know if it's good or bad. So in this case, you would offload this malware to an execution environment, run it, come back with a decision. Now this has its own challenges, right? It takes time to run this malware, and maybe the malware is set that it hangs and waits for 30 minutes before it does something. That's very difficult to catch, and you're certainly not going to let the user sit in a limbo where they can't execute the file for 30 minutes. So I see this usually in a use case where it's used to detect and not necessarily prevent the execution of malware. And that's, of course, at a host-based level. But at a network-based level, you can do the same thing, right? You can implement network-based AV and sandboxing. And in that case, when you're talking network level, SSL decryption becomes essential. I don't know why I said practically essential. It is essential. The majority of those downloads, right, they're going to be over an SSL connection. If the attacker has any wits about them. So in the case of exploitation, what do you think we could do here? This one gets a little interesting.
I'm in.
Damn it. Products, man, products. Let's go with operating system stuff.
That one's free.
It is.
It's still medicines.
It is vendor specific. What about DEP and ASLR? Yes. In this case, it'll slow the development of an exploit. It's been kind of proven that since Windows 7 implemented DEP and ASLR that it can be circumvented and turned off. Often there's legacy libraries that were written in like 1993 with Windows 3.1, and people like to reuse them a lot. So in the case that those are loaded, maybe they have a vulnerability and it doesn't execute in a DEP environment. So where do you go from there? Something like Emmet, and there are other good products out there, a memory protection software, something that would wrap the executables and monitor that memory, right? It can force DEP in the case of the libraries that don't natively support it, and it will monitor that memory for things like buffer overflows or use after free exploits. And at a network level, there's still exploitation. That's kind of the core of why an IPS was developed, right? So this will give you client and server-side protections. Again, oh man, I didn't have it on there. SSL decryption is key. If you can't see it, you can't stop it. In fact, you can't detect it even. So, moving on to installation. From a host level, there's a few things you can do, right? AV, whitelisting, the principle of least privilege. Now, this isn't a technology. Excuse me. This is a process or kind of a framework that you would implement. Maybe remove the admin access from your users. and only allow admin access to specific IT job functions. Maybe network admins can be an admin because they need to go change the IP address to configure network hardware. I would hope there's not a lot of use cases for admins on networks, but it tends to happen, and admittedly I'm an admin, so it happens. Don't shake it. I'm sorry.
Principle of least privilege.
I need admin for my machine. The whole network thing, changing IP addresses.
Should be a second account.
Oh no. I'm sorry. Right there, the third bullet point. UAC or some other advanced, not that UAC is advanced, I'm saying UAC or an advanced credential checkout system or credential management system. Something that can delegate access to users and be logged. UAC is kind of okay because it makes the user at least acknowledge that they're doing something dumb, but I don't even know that it's logged, which moves me to my next point about logging. Logging is not very feasible on workstations. I don't think a lot of people would be happy that you're chewing up even maybe, I don't know, let's assume maybe 1 meg of streaming Windows logs. Windows logs are noisy, right? Yes?
You can tune them.
You can tune them. I think it's very difficult to make this feasible. Think of a location like maybe this building. I'd say maybe 1,500, 2,000 users, give or take. That could potentially be a lot of bandwidth, or just annoying to the user, even if they do know that it's chewing up cycles on their machine. But it's definitely possible on servers and should be implemented on servers. Now there's a bit of a metagame here. Logging is great, and the things that logs tell you are great. But the gaps in logging, or say when a device stops logging, it was previously logging and then it stopped for a second, and then things happen, bad things happen, and it starts logging again. That should be a key, right? When devices go dark, that's a pretty good indication that something bad has happened. Now in the case of networking, I think you're just shit out of luck. I'm sorry guys, there's really nothing you can do from a network level to detect or stop installation of malware once it's already on a machine. Of course it's in the host domain at that point. So in the case of command and control, right, moving back to the network side, this is kind of where I'll say network really has a favor versus host-based technologies. With IPS and anti-spyware signatures, different vendors call them different things, but basically detections for that command and control traffic, right? Known things that we know are bad. Maybe command and control traffic for CryptoWall or Zeus, or pick your botnet of choice. Another nice, I'll say nice to have but not always effective measure would be subscriptions or feeds. ISACs, FBI watch lists, or the SANS ISC. These are good for really high profile malware. It's not going to catch your low 20% occurrence things, the things that are rare but impactful. And again, SSL decryption is crucial. If you can't see it, you can't do anything about it. In the world of host-based technologies to block command and control, once the malware is already installed, it's pretty difficult to detect. In that case, honestly, dump the session table and take a look and see what you can find. I know there are products out there, and I feel like I can mention this because our company doesn't make one, like Tanium or Carbon Black, that can give you connection table info. And that's where that becomes pretty useful, is if you know the IP address of that command and control server, and you have machines that are maybe not behind a logging device, maybe not behind a firewall for whatever reason, but you do have access to scour the session table. There you go. You could use that as a way to detect command and control traffic. So what about actions on the objective? This is the last category, right, of that cyber attack lifecycle. This is where you exfiltrate and repeat. Game over? Do you guys think so? Do you think this is it?
Oh wait, there's more.
God damn it. Or is it? Not all exploits are really a game over scenario. I think there's a lot to be done after a machine is already compromised. Privilege escalation is often required, and this will leave behind, I'll say artifacts in the on the host system, registry entries, gaps in the logs again, processes writing to locations that are not normal, or starting other processes that are not normal. Oftentimes, I wouldn't expect to see notepad.exe start PowerShell, for example, or other weird, anomalies. Most executables are terminal, and that's obviously not the case with services or system executables. But the things that you run to do things like Outlook, that should be a terminal executable. It shouldn't spawn other things. Does it? Oh man, I'm sorry. Told you to keep me honest.
Stick with nil then.
And in the case of exfiltration, right, this is another big objective that people, malicious actors trying to accomplish. You can obviously implement firewall policy to block outbound file transfers. Things like maybe not every user should use SFTP or SFTP to known good sites, things that have a business reason. And then network forensics. If you take a look at the logs in NetFlow, you can often find, I'll say the top 5% and bottom 5%. The things that I find interesting from a top 5% would be the top connections, or connections that happen all the time. Maybe it's a very chatty CNC protocol, right? And it connects back it has a session open all the time and sends a packet every 5 seconds. In that case, I would hope that would show up in your top 5% of, maybe not bytes transferred, but top 5% of sessions, if it maybe start a new session each time. And then look at the bottom 5%. If it is something that holds open a session for a long period of time, that would show up as a very rare occurrence, right? That should be one hit count in your session table to that IP address. So that's where I would personally start. Look at the things that happen often and look at the things that don't happen often. Ignore the middle. The middle is daily user behavior, hopefully. So that maps the technologies to the different types or different stages of the attack lifecycle. Now, in the case of like maybe spear phishing, do you guys have any ideas how you try and prevent this?
Educate users.
Damn it, that's a good one. That's actually probably the best one. I can't believe I forgot about that. That's a process though, right? That's not technology.
Sure.
Yep. So the way I go about it, and this is me personally, I would implement some form of URL filtering, right? Block phishing categories if the service has it. So the sites that host, say maybe it's your Panda Forms or SurveyMonkey or whatever the hell it is, and it's a form asking for user credentials. It happens, and block the unknown category if there is the concept of unknown in that URL filtering solution. Most have it, and in general, a mature one shouldn't have a lot of hits against that category, and if it does, that needs to be worked on. I would implement, of course, network and host-based AV. And again, these are mapping to the delivery stage of this attack. And this attack, actually, spear phishing, is mostly about delivery of malware. It's really a part of the life cycle in the delivery stage. And then malware detonation, right? Execute the malware and see if it's good or bad. This isn't always useful for preventing, but like I said, you can at least detect it and then remediate at that point. And then whitelisting. In the case of something that is downloaded, maybe it is a spear phishing email, and it has an attachment with the expense report.pdf with a million spaces. In that case, just don't allow execution from the temp internet folder or temp Outlook folder. I know it sounds easy. I'm sure there's a lot of hiccups here. So, any ideas in the case of crypto ransomware? These are the crypto walls of the world, fake AV. Where would you guys start? You see, there's a theme here. Backups, right at the bottom there. Again, not a technology, but a process. Sometimes it's easier just to wipe the system and restart, right? Restore it from a backup. Hopefully user machines don't have data directly on them. I would, in general, a mature organization should be backing up to some central source and doing version control on that. So you can maybe back up to the version that was 7 days old, that before the malware was installed, and wipe the user machine. Just blow it away and let them use the network stores for their storage. In the case of network and host-based AV in the delivery stage, I tend to see this not being effective at all. Especially CryptoWall, it was very polymorphic. They changed it all the time. You weren't going to catch it with a simple hash. But in the case of crypto ransomware, in general, most of them have a process about them where it won't encrypt your data if they can't connect back to the command and control server. Right? The whole point of CryptoWall 3 was to encrypt the data, send the keys to the server so that when you call up their help support and say, I need my stuff back, when you give them bitcoins, they'll give you the key to decrypt it. If they don't have the key, the whole concept's broken, and quite frankly, they lose credibility. And it sounds weird, but that actually matters to them. They don't want people just to say screw it and restart, start over with no data. They actually want people to pay for it, so they push for good. I'll say they. I'm not sure who they are exactly, but there actually is good customer support there and making sure that they can decrypt your data. So in the case of command and control signatures, if it's something that you know about and it talks home to a server that say your vendor of choice knows about, and you block that command and control, who cares? If you have a machine that's infected, it can sit there all day trying to connect home, and if it doesn't leave the network, which it shouldn't, but it might happen, then it'll never be encrypted. You'll never have a problem, and it's been exploited and you're compromised with no impact, which is not a stance most companies want to take, but I believe it's a valid one. And then of course the URL filtering again for the delivery stage. And this is one that actually I kind of love because I was there for it when Heartbleed was first. I want to say 2014 when it was announced and it came out that holy crap, you can pull memory off a server running OpenSSL .98 or something, 0.98 or whatever the hell it was. So what about the next one? You have a vulnerability where it performs unauthenticated information disclosure. On the case of that, I would basically look only at the exploitation stage of the attack lifecycle and implement IPS signatures. Maybe a firewall policy if it's not a mission critical app, and you can take it offline. Maybe you do it until you can patch it. And I see patching as a counter here to the exploitation, of course, because not all exploits are 0 days, and many have patches available through responsible disclosure, either the day of release of the vulnerability, or hopefully if it's a company that's on the ball a month or more before. So anyway, at a high level, this is how I take a look at the stages of the attack lifecycle and implement technologies to effectively stop that. And this is really what I see as being defense in depth at its core. And really want to clear up the, I'll say misconception that defense in depth is vendor diversity. So with that, any questions? Kyle.
So, you stated back at, no, I'm just kidding.
Oh my God.
The one thing you said installation, and you
Mhm.
said network, there wasn't much you could do.
Yes.
But in reality, much like what you just said, if you're blocking CNC known domains,
Mm-hmm.
or if you're blocking in general any access to the internet, if malware tries to echo out, it will not potentially either execute, it'll lay dormant, give you more time to try and find it. So I guess that could be a defensive control.
I think that plays nicely too into the time equation that Don had mentioned, right? That could give you a log to detect on. And thank you. I didn't think about the case where malware wouldn't install if it can't connect out.
Yeah.
It could give you a log to detect on, and you could go remediate before it even performs a malicious action, much in the case of the crypto ransomware.
Except for the stuff that's RSA, public-private,
Yeah.
because they hate you.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway.
Things happen. Yes.
On that same topic, I was kind of curious, why wouldn't you have touched on access control lists? How that works?
So are we talking firewall ACLs or?
Firewall, ACLs, or within the routers themselves?
So I think I didn't really touch on it. You're right, although I probably meant to. In the case of, oh my God.
You're welcome.
I don't know where the hell I had that. In the case of indicator or compromised feeds, that's really where I see an ACL being useful. ACLs are great if you know what to block, but you see a lot of ACLs that either allow everything because they want something to work now, or ACLs that deny everything because it's too difficult to figure out the things that are good. So you'll say maybe at the perimeter, put an ACL in that says, don't allow anything out. And then as exceptions come up, right, as a user needs SFTP access to a partner company that you do business with, you open it. I think it's of course a natural extension of defense in depth. I can't believe I didn't mention it much. But I only really see those being super useful when you have some intelligence that feeds into your solution. Right. In the case of a IOC feed. it's very difficult to maintain blacklists on your own without some automated way of keeping that up to date. Kate?
In the context of crypto ransomware, you kept mentioning they and control. Is they you and you mean
No, no.
yourself at all? Or?
The adversary?
Yeah, I would consider they as the adversary. They being whoever runs it. I know it's different for different campaigns, right? I'm generalizing quite a bit, but the high-profile ones like Crypto Wall 3, that had a huge rate of, I'll say, success of stopping infections by just disallowing command and control, or a machine that gets infected can't talk out to the internet. In the case of Kyle's example, and they had there's a lot of stories out there about them performing good customer service, right? Maybe they're on the phone with your grandma and they're actually walking them through how to go to a site to buy a Bitcoin to transfer it. That's a crazy level of customer service, and every other company, including ones I may have worked for, and Microsoft, and every high-profile company, they won't go to that level of support normally to interact with a third-party or tangential service to what they provide. Most companies won't do that, and it really is kind of extraordinary that they again, being the attacker or whoever runs the organization that installed the malware or the malware is phoning home to. It's incredible that they went to that length. Don?
No questions for you?
All right. Sam, what's up?
So I'm not sure you'll have an answer for this one, but I just thought of it. Have you ever heard of anybody trolling the command or the customer service for ransomware people to try and waste their time?
Absolutely. Maybe not necessarily explicitly to waste their time, but to find out information. There's some good videos out there of people doing that where they've recorded that halfway through, and it's if we had time to kill, I'd show you. I remember seeing a few on YouTube back in like 2013 that were pretty funny.
And there's a recent one where the Microsoft caller
Yeah.
and he built a virtual machine.
Yep.
Had all kinds
Well,
of
I mean ransomware. Those
Well-
people specifically, not the classic Microsoft.
In the case of phishing calls like that, I would say I wouldn't be surprised, and I don't know this for sure from an industry standpoint, but I wouldn't be surprised if the phishing calls like that are to install some form of ransomware. And maybe it is, probably in the case of the older ones, it was probably just fake AV that said, you have a virus, pay for our service, and we'll remove it. And really, that virus was that software.
Some of the more sophisticated ones are actually doing botnets out of that. Yeah, there's a storm.
Holy shit.
So I would not recommend walking to nightlights.
That's a bummer. I really had to catch some Pokemon.
It's not very long. It's not a very wide storm.
That's-
You
it
wait
can be a
10
short
minutes,
burst.
it'll be gone.
Cool.
They're starting to have a lot of the scammers, the really sophisticated ones, are doing botnets and installing extra stuff in the background, grabbing more than just information. They're leaving stuff behind to later exploit. So,
That's smart. Leaving,
unfortunately,
yeah.
they're getting smart.
It makes remediation very difficult, right? I mean, if you do have a signature for that particular thing and AV says, okay, this is bad, what about, those other services that are listening or have been installed or maybe are waiting? This window's tinted kind of purple, so it looks terrifying out that window.
That's
That's
pretty
actually
scary.
why Ben left, because he's on a motorcycle, so.
What a girl.
If only he looked at the map, he could have waited 10 minutes and it would be fine.
So another, you sparked a thought.
Yeah, not wide. It's,
Now we're
So another interesting botnet that I've seen pop up that maybe not, might not be top of mind. Normally when you think of botnets, right, you think of denial of service specific botnets. I've seen a few that have been around, and I mean they're actually they're not uncommon at all. They're very common. I believe it's called VicNock. It came out in like 2013 or maybe early 2014. It existed for the sole purpose of the bot master hitting ad websites to generate ad revenue. So instead of being used for denial of service purposes, it was used for revenue generation, which actually I think is probably a much better way of using that service for monetary gain. I would imagine. I don't know the prices to rent a botnet these days, but I would imagine renting out your botnet probably doesn't end up working out because people will figure it out and shut it down. Whereas if you just use it to generate ad revenue and do it slowly over time with tons of bots, good luck finding it, right?
That's click fraud is the name of that.
Yeah, good call. Couldn't think of the name. Yep. Yeah, the specific one I'm thinking of it was called VicNock, but it was like, just a variation of a type of botnet piece of malware.
So Don,
Yes, sir.
do you have any disagreements between what Matt said compared to some of the models we talked about?
No, I don't have any specific disagreements. I mean, we covered the fact that I get cautious about sticking to one platform. That I think there's a lot of areas to look for the best of breed, and to make sure that I know that they're focusing their R&D on being the best at that.
Question for you.
But yes, sir.
What if a company happens to be a consolidation of technologies on a particular platform, but is also best of breed? Kind of
So
hits both points.
generally, I don't have any problem with that, because if they are best of breed, that reputation driver should keep them heading there.
What about
I think it does.
something like IBM or something buys everything and then makes them crap?
That happens, and that's actually what I'm pretty concerned about in a consolidation play, right?
Yeah, that's exactly what Matt was talking about. Well,
Yeah,
exactly.
I wanted to avoid specific companies, but are we recording?
Yeah.
A network and hardware manufacturer. I work with people who have worked there before, and they've mentioned that security spend, or actually security revenue for this company, is only about 2% of their total revenue, right? So if it's 2% of the revenue, it's not unreasonable to estimate that it's 2% of their R&D spend or M&A spend. It's a company like that I'd be more worried about dealing with, and I have ran their products before, and it just doesn't feel like security is top of mind, even though they have a security product.
And just because Kate mentioned IBM doesn't mean that Matt's talking about IBM.
Yes,
Or not talking about IBM.
I'm not talking about IBM. I'm sorry, I just have to be particularly careful. Yeah. But you don't.
So no, back to your question, Kyle. I definitely think, as both of us talked about, you have to consider those things.
So then, how does cyber insurance fall into any of these models?
Quite frankly,
That ain't me.
quite frankly,
I want to be involved in cyber insurance.
Don, do you know?
If all your controls fail, then you have your insurance as your final backup. Not the
You know,
final solution, because that's different.
I'm not advocating this. I've heard interesting counterpoints to that idea, or really counterpoints supporting that idea, counterpoints to my arguments as a systems engineer on the pre-sale side. Your product costs X amount, and cyber insurance will cover, the cost of a breach, and paying for insurance ends up being less than your product. Why don't I just do nothing and then just pay for insurance? I don't think it's realistic. I don't think it's really an option. I know cyber insurance will cover damages. There are things that will tank a company, not to spread FUD, right? But major PCI disclosures to a smaller company, maybe not to Home Depot, but a smaller company, that could be fines to the point where it would tank the company.
They're also adding new legislation to fine companies that are not following proper procedures. For instance, banks are now able to charge
Better call the power company.
residences that don't, if they don't follow procedures like the new PIN,
Yep.
the chips. You don't have a chip reader in your place of business. If the data breach came from your place of business, you're paying all the charges for
Yep.
recovering that money. So if you're a small company and someone got hit for $30,000, you're paying $30,000, and there goes your company.
Yep.
And they're starting to get more and more.
And I think a lot of companies I'll say medium-sized companies are responding to that idea, and they already knew it was a problem anyway, at least at the IT level, maybe not the management level. A good friend of mine works at Big B Coffee, and they have been overhauling their systems with a new point of sale to be as secure as possible.
So
And
it'll
it's,
become the next fast food chain.
I'm a big fan of them because they're doing the right things from an IT standpoint, and I like their coffee and I like their breakfast sandwiches. And a friend works there.
That's not
But-
endorsement.
It's not an endorsement,
or discrediting
but
another fast food chain.
I think it's an interesting case of them actually doing the right thing simply because their IT staff is on top of it. It's not being driven purely by compliance, but there is a compliance aspect, right? It's a threat of fining. Yeah.
And insurance is a business decision, right? Anything you don't get external insurance for, you're self-insuring effectively. The problem with cybersecurity insurance is that, number one, the actuary tables aren't there, so you're probably paying a little bit more for it.
Mm-hmm.
But it may be cheaper than carrying that risk on your own balance sheet.
And
Number two is there's so many exclusions and limitations that you really got to understand your policy.
yep. Yeah, you need a lawyer to cover that essentially. And on top of that, I'm sure, I don't know this to be the case, but I can't imagine it wouldn't be. There are companies out there that do not just pen testing, but I'll say passive security posture assessments and give you a rating, much like a credit rating. And I wouldn't be surprised at all if that's being used as input into the insurance, pricing model. So if you have a poor security posture, I'm sure you're going to be paying more. I don't know that for sure, but that's how the industry works, and it can't be worth it at a point.
The other thing that security or insurance is starting to give you access to is a lot of insurance companies they're adding like these additional features, right? So you get access to a breach coach who come in before you get breached, and will talk to your executives, talk to your security managers on how to handle breaches and what policies you may want to adjust to help cover yourself from a legal standpoint. Like as an example, not to use the word breach. That if we're talking,
A disclosure of information.
we should not ever use the term breach, because legally breach kind of starts a clock. Breach means something from a legal standpoint.
Yep.
And if I say we've been breached, another party could then say, well, wait a second, you didn't notify us within this amount of time, and that's when you were breached. So there's all these kind of caveats that.
And you see the same thing too in, I'll say, other regulated compliance areas like PCI, NERC-CIP, HIPAA. There's keywords that they use to determine when an event happens, like incident. It really depends on the company and the industry, but I've heard incident also be thrown around, right? That you don't say there's an incident until you know something. There's an event, or there's a anomaly, or call it what you want, just don't call it an incident.
It's like in a care facility or a hospital, if you come upon a patient and they're on the floor, you do not say patient fell. You say patient was found on the floor, stating that they fell.
Yeah. The wording matters, and what's unfortunate is new people to an industry don't necessarily know that when you join, and it can cause problems.
And getting that kind of consulting feels like it's for free if you're paying your premiums to get.
It's goodwill, right?
When of course certainly it's
Any other questions? Did everybody bring rain jackets and umbrellas?
Nope. We all parked in a garage with covered access, though, right?
How long can we stay in the building?
You can be here for a little while.
so Kyle leaves.
Yeah. Last man standing.
So does anybody have masking or duct tape?
What?
Kyle leaves.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay. I think I missed why at first.
And on that note, that's
Yep.
our MySec night.
Thank you, everybody, for joining us.